The moment the front door opened, my mother-in-law stopped smiling. Not gradually, not politely. It vanished from her face so fast it almost frightened me. 1 second, Gloria Bennett stood in the middle of my baby shower holding a teacup and humiliating me in front of half the church community. The next second, she looked like someone had walked in carrying the answer to a question she'd spent years trying not to hear. The room went completely silent. Even Melissa stopped smirking. I remember sitting there 7 months pregnant with my hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea, wondering how a celebration for my daughter had somehow turned into a public reminder that I didn't truly belong in my own home. Then the elderly woman standing in the doorway removed her gloves slowly and said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding in this family for a very long time." And just like that, everything I believed about my marriage began shifting beneath my feet. But before I explain who she was and why Gloria suddenly looked terrified, you need to understand how we got there in the first place. Because family humiliations like that rarely happen overnight. They build quietly, year after year, one swallowed insult at a time. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 36 years old that winter, pregnant with my first child, and living in a 2-story colonial house outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with my husband Ethan and his mother Gloria. Technically, Melissa didn't live there. Ethan's younger sister just appeared often enough that it felt permanent. Especially whenever there was tension. Melissa loved tension the way some people love reality television. She fed on it. By the time of the baby shower, I had already spent nearly 9 years trying to convince myself I was imagining how unwelcome I often felt inside that family. That's the dangerous thing about emotional neglect. It usually arrives disguised as small moments. Little comments, little silences, little humiliations nobody else calls cruel enough to confront. And because they happen gradually, you keep adjusting yourself around them, until one day you barely recognize the version of yourself doing all the apologizing. When I first met Ethan Bennett, none of that existed yet. Or maybe it did, and I simply didn't know how to see it. I worked as a hospice nurse back then at a small care facility outside Harrisburg. Ethan had his own construction company with 2 trucks, 3 employees, and big dreams about expanding into commercial projects someday. He was gentle in those early years. Quiet, dependable, the kind of man who fixed broken shelves without being asked and remembered how I took my coffee. After years working around death and grieving families, his calmness felt safe to me. Looking back now, I think I confused emotional avoidance with kindness. There's a difference. Kind men protect your peace. Avoidant men protect themselves from discomfort. But you don't always understand that distinction when you're lonely and hopeful and trying to build a future with someone. At first, Gloria seemed welcoming enough. She brought casseroles after Ethan and I married, asked about my nursing shifts, told church friends how lucky Ethan was to find such a caring girl. But slowly, subtle things began changing. If Ethan complimented my cooking, Gloria reminded everyone Ethan preferred her meatloaf recipe growing up. If I organized holidays, she quietly rearranged decorations afterward. If Ethan and I disagreed about something privately, somehow Gloria always found out. And Melissa never even pretended to like me. She's too sensitive, she used to tell Ethan openly while I sat right there in the room. Sometimes people reveal exactly how little they respect you by how comfortable they feel criticizing you in front of others. Still, I kept trying. Women from my generation were taught marriage required endurance. Compromise, patience, sacrifice. Especially if you wanted family harmony. So when Ethan's business nearly collapsed 4 years into our marriage after a contractor lawsuit drained most of our savings, I stepped in quietly without telling many people how serious things really were. I picked up extra nursing shifts. Sold jewelry my father left me. Handled late-night bookkeeping after Ethan fell asleep exhausted at the kitchen table. And eventually, when things became desperate enough, I made one decision that changed the entire course of our marriage. A decision Ethan still didn't fully understand by the time of that baby shower. But I'll come back to that. By the afternoon of the shower, snow flurries drifted softly across Lancaster County, while churchwomen carried trays of cookies and wrapped baby gifts through the front door. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and baked ham. I should have felt happy. Instead, I felt nervous from the moment I woke up. Pregnancy had made me emotional in ways I didn't always recognize anymore. Not dramatic emotional, just tender, easily bruised. And Gloria had spent the entire week criticizing everything about the shower. Too many flowers, too many desserts, too expensive, too sentimental. At one point, she actually sighed while arranging decorations and said, "Well, I suppose Claire's trying her best." Trying her best. As though I were a guest volunteer instead of the mother carrying Ethan's child. By 2 o'clock, the living room was packed with relatives, church friends, neighbors, and women from Gloria's Bible study group. Melissa stayed close to Gloria most of the afternoon, whispering comments that made them both laugh quietly together. Ethan floated around awkwardly, refilling drinks and avoiding tension the way he always did. Then came the moment I can still replay perfectly in my head. Gloria stood up beside the fireplace holding her teacup. The room gradually quieted. She smiled at everyone warmly before saying, "Let's just be honest for a second. This house belongs to my son." A few uncomfortable laughs scattered across the room. My stomach tightened instantly. Melissa smirked openly. Ethan stared down at the floor. And then Gloria looked directly at my pregnant belly. She should remember who built this family. Not Claire. She. As though I were already outside the circle looking in. The room went painfully quiet after that. I lowered my eyes to the teacup in my hands, mostly because I could feel tears threatening behind them. That's when the front door opened. Cold winter air swept softly through the hallway, and Gloria stopped smiling. I looked up slowly. An elegant older woman stood in the doorway, wearing a long camel-colored coat, dusted lightly with snow. Eleanor Whitmore. The owner of the house, though at that moment I still didn't know it yet. Nobody moved when Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the living room. Not Gloria, not Melissa, not Ethan. And certainly not me. The only sound in the entire house came from the soft hum of Christmas music still playing through the kitchen speaker. Some old Bing Crosby song drifted awkwardly through the silence, while snow blew lightly against the front windows. Eleanor removed her gloves slowly like a woman completely unbothered by tension. That alone told me she understood exactly what kind of room she had walked into. She looked to be in her early 70s, maybe older. Beautiful in the elegant way some women become beautiful after surviving enough life to stop performing for anyone. Silver hair pinned neatly back, pearl earrings, calm posture. The kind of woman who made people straighten unconsciously when she entered a room. Gloria recovered first. "Eleanor," she said tightly, "this is unexpected." Eleanor's expression remained perfectly pleasant. I imagine honesty often is. Melissa shifted awkwardly beside the fireplace. Several women from church exchanged confused glances. I looked toward Ethan, waiting for him to explain who exactly this woman was and why his mother suddenly looked like she might faint into the punch bowl. But Ethan looked just as confused as I felt. Then Eleanor's eyes found mine, and immediately softened. "There you are," she said gently. "I was worried I'd missed the party." Something inside me tightened unexpectedly at the kindness in her voice. I can't explain it properly unless you've spent years being emotionally diminished. Sometimes basic warmth feels shocking when you haven't received enough of it. "Would someone mind helping me with my coat?" Eleanor asked calmly. Nobody moved. Finally, I stood up carefully despite my pregnant back aching. "I can take it," I said softly. Gloria looked horrified by that. Not because I offered help. Because I treated Eleanor like someone important. And somehow instinctively Gloria knew I was about to discover something she'd spent years trying to keep buried. Eleanor handed me her coat with a small grateful smile. "Thank you, Claire." Hearing my name spoken kindly in that room nearly made me emotional all over again. When I returned to my seat, Eleanor remained standing. "I apologize for interrupting," she said to the room politely, "but after hearing what was just said, I thought perhaps clarification was necessary." Gloria's face tightened immediately. "There's nothing to clarify." Eleanor looked at her calmly. "I disagree." The room became so quiet I could hear someone stirring coffee in the kitchen. Melissa crossed her arms. With all due respect, she snapped, "This is a family matter." Eleanor turned toward her. "Yes," she said evenly, "that's precisely why I'm here." Then she looked directly at me. "Claire," she asked gently, "does Ethan know how the house was saved?" I frowned immediately. "What do you mean?" Across the room, Gloria whispered sharply, "Eleanor!" But Eleanor ignored her completely. Instead, she took a seat slowly near the fireplace and folded her hands in her lap. "There's no graceful way left to discuss this," she said quietly, "so I'll simply tell the truth." Every instinct in my body suddenly went tense. Because deep down I already knew whatever came next would change something permanently. Eleanor looked toward Ethan. 4 years ago, your business was less than 3 weeks from bankruptcy. Ethan stiffened. "I know that." "No," Eleanor replied gently. "You knew part of it." The room remained frozen around us. Eleanor continued calmly. "The lawsuit against your company was far worse financially than you realized. Your accounts were nearly empty. The bank was preparing foreclosure paperwork on this property." I blinked slowly. Most people in the room looked stunned. Except Gloria. Gloria looked cornered. Ethan frowned deeply. "That's impossible. We worked out payment arrangements." Eleanor's eyes shifted toward me then. "Because Claire stepped in." My throat tightened immediately. "No," I whispered softly. "Not here, not like this." But Eleanor kept going. "She used part of her inheritance from her late father as collateral to stabilize the debt temporarily." The room seemed to tilt sideways for a second. Melissa let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What inheritance?" I stared down at my hands. Because suddenly every sacrifice I had worked so hard to keep invisible was being dragged painfully into the open. "My father left me some savings," I admitted quietly. Ethan turned toward me sharply. "You told me it was mostly medical bills and retirement money." "It was." "Then how?" "I borrowed against it," I said softly. Silence crashed over the room again. Women from church stared openly now. Melissa looked annoyed more than shocked. But Ethan looked devastated. Not angry. Devastated. Like someone suddenly realizing the ground beneath his marriage had never been what he thought. Eleanor spoke carefully. "When the bank situation became critical, I purchased the property temporarily through a protected arrangement." Ethan blinked. "What?" "The house was transferred under my holding company to prevent foreclosure proceedings during litigation." I could physically feel people trying to understand what she was saying. Gloria finally exploded. "You had no right to expose this in front of everyone." Eleanor turned toward her. "And you had no right humiliating a pregnant woman in her own home." That landed like a slap. Nobody breathed. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "Especially when the home only still exists because of her sacrifices." Melissa scoffed loudly. "Oh, please, Claire always plays the martyr." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. And for the first time in years, I realized something strange. I was tired of defending myself. Not angry. Just tired. "Melissa," I said quietly. "I worked double shifts for almost a year while Ethan tried saving the company." She rolled her eyes. "So that's marriage?" "Yes," I answered softly, "it is." And somehow that calmness unsettled her more than shouting ever could. Ethan finally spoke again, voice unsteady. "You saved the house." I looked down. "I was trying to save us." That sentence broke something open in the room. Because suddenly all the family mythology about Ethan building everything himself no longer fit reality. The truth was messier. More human. More painful. Gloria sat down slowly like her knees had weakened beneath her. "She shouldn't have told anyone," she muttered bitterly. Eleanor looked genuinely astonished by that response. "She didn't," she said quietly. "I did." And that was true. For 4 years I had protected Ethan's pride so carefully that even now, sitting there, publicly humiliated, part of me still felt guilty for embarrassing him. Women from my generation are trained to protect men emotionally, even while collapsing ourselves. That training runs deep. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "I didn't know." "I know," I answered gently. And that was the tragedy of it. He truly didn't know. Not because I hid things maliciously. Because over time our marriage had developed around one dangerous pattern. I carried painful things quietly, and Ethan accepted comfort without asking enough questions about its cost. That pattern almost destroyed us. The baby shower ended awkwardly after that. Women gathered purses and casserole dishes with the frantic politeness Americans use when trying to escape emotional disaster gracefully. Melissa stormed upstairs furious. Gloria disappeared into the kitchen without another word. And Ethan stood alone beside the fireplace looking at me like he no longer understood his own life. Later that evening, after everyone finally left, he asked the question I think had been haunting him all afternoon. "Claire," he whispered, "what else have you been carrying by yourself?" I looked at him for a very long time before answering. Because suddenly, after years of silence, I wasn't sure I knew how to explain the weight anymore. I left the house 2 days after the baby shower. Not dramatically. No screaming, no packed suitcases thrown into cars, no threats about divorce. By your mid-30s especially, once you've worked around illness and death long enough, you learn most life-changing decisions happen quietly. Mine happened while folding baby clothes. I was standing in the nursery Ethan and I had painted pale yellow 3 weekends earlier. Tiny onesies sat stacked beside the crib while winter sunlight stretched softly across the carpet. And suddenly I realized I couldn't breathe properly in that house anymore. Not physically. Emotionally. Every room felt crowded with years of swallowed feelings. Gloria's criticism, Melissa's contempt, Ethan's silence. I had spent so much energy trying to make everyone comfortable that somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing how lonely I'd become. By that afternoon, Eleanor Whitmore was helping me carry an overnight bag into her farmhouse outside Lidditz. "You don't need much," she said gently as we drove through snowy back roads lined with bare trees and old Pennsylvania barns. "I'm only staying a few days." Eleanor gave me a look older women reserve for younger women still trying to minimize their own suffering. "Of course you are." The farmhouse sat on several quiet acres outside town, surrounded by frozen fields and old stone fences dusted with snow. The place smelled faintly like cedarwood tea and old books. Safe. That's the first word that came to mind when I walked inside. Not fancy, not luxurious. Just safe. Eleanor gave me a bedroom overlooking the back pasture where several horses wandered slowly through the cold morning fog. "You rest," she told me. "The world will survive without you for a few days." I almost laughed at that. Because women like me secretly spend years believing everything will collapse if we stop holding it together. The first night there, I slept nearly 11 hours. I hadn't realized how exhausted I truly was until my body finally stopped bracing itself for criticism. That's the strange thing about chronic emotional tension. You stop recognizing it as stress because it becomes your normal atmosphere. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee and cinnamon oatmeal downstairs. Eleanor stood in the kitchen wearing thick wool socks and reading glasses while listening to public radio. "You look human again," she said casually. I slept. Exactly. We ate breakfast quietly while snow drifted outside the windows. Finally, Eleanor looked at me over her coffee mug. "How long have you been disappearing inside that marriage?" The question startled me because it was so direct. Not cruel, not judgmental. Just honest. I stared down at my oatmeal for a moment. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." And unfortunately, she was right. The truth is, women usually know exactly when they started shrinking themselves. We just spend years pretending we don't. I leaned back slowly in the kitchen chair. Probably after Gloria's surgery. Eleanor nodded slightly like she already suspected that. 3 years earlier, Gloria had fallen and fractured her hip during an icy winter storm. Recovery had been difficult. Ethan's construction business was unstable. Melissa rarely helped consistently despite living only 20 minutes away. So naturally, most responsibility fell to me. I drove Gloria to physical therapy appointments, organized medications, cooked meals, handled insurance paperwork, cleaned the house, managed Ethan's invoices at night after my nursing shifts. For nearly 8 months, I slept maybe 5 hours a night. Nobody forced me to do it. That's what makes emotional labor so dangerous. Women volunteer for it because we love people. Then eventually everyone begins treating our sacrifice like our personality instead of an effort. Eleanor listened quietly while I talked. She used to criticize me while I was helping her shower, I admitted softly. "Can you imagine that?" Eleanor snorted softly into her coffee. "Oh, I can imagine far worse. I've lived 73 years. That made me laugh unexpectedly. And once I started laughing, I suddenly started crying too. Hard. Pregnancy hormones probably intensified everything, but honestly, those tears had been building for years. "I don't understand why I wasn't enough," I whispered. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "Oh, Claire," she said quietly, "this was never about whether you were enough." That sentence stayed with me long afterward. Because deep down, I think many women carry a secret fear that mistreatment means failure. If we were kinder, prettier, less emotional, more patient, better wives, maybe people would love us correctly. But unhealthy families often consume kindness without appreciating it. That's not the caregiver's failure. That's the family's wound. Meanwhile, back at the house, things apparently began unraveling quickly without me there buffering everyone emotionally. I learned this gradually through Ethan's phone calls over the next several days. At first, he called mostly about practical things. "Do you know where the pediatric insurance forms are?" "In the kitchen drawer beside the coupons." "Mom's prescription refill account needs a password." "It's your birthday backwards." "How do you reset the upstairs thermostat schedule?" I answered automatically every time. Years of caregiving had programmed me that way. But eventually, even Ethan began hearing the imbalance in those conversations. One evening, he called sounding unusually tired. The washing machine overflowed. I closed my eyes briefly. "Did you overload it again?" A pause. "Maybe." Despite everything, I smiled. Not because it was funny exactly. Because for the first time in years, Ethan was finally experiencing what daily family maintenance actually required. Invisible work becomes visible very quickly once nobody is quietly doing it anymore. Later that same night, Ethan called again. This time he sounded different. Emotionally different. "I found your bookkeeping folders," he said quietly. My stomach tightened slightly. "Oh." Inside those folders lived years of hidden survival, late payments. I quietly handled credit extensions. I negotiated savings transfers, medical bills, business tax notes, household budgets. The architecture of stability nobody ever noticed because I built it silently. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "You paid the business insurance yourself twice." I looked out the farmhouse window toward the snowy fields. "You were behind on payroll." "You never told me." "You already felt overwhelmed." Silence filled the line. Then softly, "How long have you been protecting me?" That question hurt more than blame would have. Because suddenly I realized something painful. Ethan truly never understood how much of our life existed, because I quietly held it together behind the scenes. Not because he was evil. Because I made his comfort look effortless. That's what women often do in marriages. We hide the labor so well people forget labor exists at all. Later that week, Ethan drove out to Eleanor's farmhouse. I saw his truck sitting near the road just beyond the pasture fence while I folded tiny baby blankets upstairs. He stayed there nearly 20 minutes. But he never came to the door. And somehow, watching him sit out there alone in the fading winter light, I realized something heartbreaking. My husband had spent years loving me the way frightened people love things. Carefully, quietly, and never quite bravely enough. A week after I moved into Eleanor's farmhouse, she took me to lunch at a small diner outside Ephrata. The kind of place older Pennsylvanians love: homemade pie-bottomless coffee waitresses who call everybody hon, and laminated menus older than some marriages. Snow still covered most of the fields along the highway, though patches of muddy grass had started breaking through. February in Pennsylvania always feels emotionally confused somehow. Winter trying to hold on while spring quietly prepares its escape. Eleanor drove slowly with both hands steady on the wheel. "You know," she said casually, "Gloria wasn't always this difficult." I stared out the passenger window. "I'm having trouble imagining that." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's because you only met the version fear created." That sentence stayed with me through most of lunch. We settled into a corner booth beneath a faded Phillies calendar, while nearby retirees discussed blood pressure medication and high school basketball. Ordinary American aging. There's something comforting about it once you reach a certain age yourself. People stop pretending life is glamorous and start talking honestly about knees grief and cholesterol. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "Gloria married young," she explained. 19, I think. I listened quietly. Frank Bennett was a decent man, worked hard, loved his children, but he died suddenly before Ethan turned 22. I nodded slowly. I knew the basic story. Heart attack, factory job, long hours, small funeral at the Lutheran church downtown. But families rarely tell the emotional truth of what happens after loss. Only the public version. She was terrified afterward, Eleanor continued softly. Financially, emotionally, spiritually. Outside the diner window, a snowplow crawled slowly through the parking lot. Fear changes people, Eleanor said, especially people who already struggle with control. That part I understood well enough. Gloria controlled everything: holiday menus, family schedules, church appearances, even emotional reactions. If Ethan looked upset, Gloria became upset louder. If someone disagreed with her, she treated disagreement like betrayal. For years, I assumed it came from arrogance. Now I was beginning to realize it came partly from survival. That didn't excuse the damage. But it explained some of it. Eleanor stirred cream into her coffee thoughtfully. After Frank died, Gloria built her whole emotional world around Ethan. I frowned slightly. What about Melissa? Eleanor gave a dry little smile. Melissa fought back. Ethan adapted. That landed painfully hard because it was true. Melissa confronted conflict directly, even cruelly. Ethan avoided conflict entirely. And somehow both children became shaped by Gloria's emotional gravity in different ways. Your husband learned very young that peace depended on keeping his mother calm, Eleanor explained gently. Boys raised that way often become men who confuse silence with kindness. I stared down at the table. That sentence described my marriage more accurately than anything I'd heard in years. Because Ethan wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He never screamed, never insulted me, never humiliated me publicly. Instead, he simply allowed things to happen while staying emotionally still beside them. And over time, that passivity became its own kind of wound. Back at the farmhouse later that afternoon, I found 2 missed calls from former coworkers at the hospice center. I almost didn't return them. Part of me still felt disconnected from my old life somehow, like marriage and caregiving had slowly erased parts of my identity I no longer knew how to reclaim. But eventually I called back. Within an hour, I found myself sitting at a small cafe in downtown Lancaster with 2 women I hadn't properly spoken to in years. Sandra and Michelle both still worked hospice care. They hugged me carefully around my pregnant belly the moment I walked in. "You look tired," Sandra said immediately. Not judgmental. Just observant. Hospice workers notice exhaustion differently than most people. We spend too many years around caregivers not to. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about ordinary things: babies, weather, hospital staffing shortages. Then Michelle asked quietly, "Are you happy, Claire?" I froze slightly. Because nobody had asked me that in a very long time. Not, "Are you managing? Are you stressed? Are you surviving?" Happy. I wrapped both hands around my tea. I don't know anymore. Neither woman looked surprised. Sandra leaned forward gently. "You disappeared after you married Ethan." The truth of that hurt immediately. Not because she meant it cruelly. Because she meant it accurately. I left hospice nursing full-time when Ethan's business became unstable. Then Gloria's surgery happened, then financial problems, then family caretaking. Year after year, my own identity became negotiable, while everyone else's needs remained solid and unquestioned. That's how emotional invisibility happens, not all at once. Gradually. Through constant adaptation. Meanwhile, Ethan had started uncovering more truths inside our marriage than either of us expected. 3 nights later, he drove out to the farmhouse unexpectedly carrying several old storage folders from the basement. "I found more records," he said quietly. We sat together at Eleanor's kitchen table while freezing rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside those folders lived the actual history of our marriage, mortgage deferments, business loan negotiations, insurance extensions, credit card transfers, my retirement withdrawals. The silent mathematics of survival. Ethan flipped through pages, slowly, visibly shaken. "You paid Mom's medical deductible yourself. She needed surgery. You drained your nursing pension. We needed payroll coverage." His voice cracked slightly. "Claire, why didn't you tell me how bad things were?" I looked at him honestly. "Because every time you got overwhelmed, you shut down emotionally. That silence afterward felt important. Not hostile. Truthful." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I thought I was protecting everybody by staying calm." "I know. But really," he swallowed hard, "I was just leaving you alone with everything." There it was. The sentence I'd needed him to understand for years. Not because I wanted punishment, Because I wanted reality acknowledged. Outside, freezing rain coated the dark Pennsylvania fields silver beneath the porch lights. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face tiredly. I think I became my mother in ways I never noticed. I looked at him carefully. And unfortunately, he was right. Not through control. Through emotional dependence. Gloria controlled people loudly. Ethan controlled situations quietly by refusing to fully participate emotionally. Different methods, same inheritance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan whispered something so honest it nearly broke my heart. I don't know how to fix this. I rested my hand gently against my stomach where the baby shifted softly beneath my sweater. Neither do I admitted. But for the first time in years, we were finally talking about the real marriage instead of pretending one existed that didn't. And strangely enough, honesty, even painful honesty, felt lighter than silence. Ethan asked me to meet him at Mel's diner the following Friday night. The same diner where we used to eat pancakes after late movies during the first year of our marriage, back when our biggest arguments involved paint colors and grocery budgets instead of emotional survival. I almost said no. Not because I hated him. That would have been easier. The harder truth was that I still loved him enough to feel tired. People over 60 understand this better than younger people often do. Long relationships rarely collapse from one dramatic betrayal. They erode quietly, one silence at a time. By the time I arrived, snow had started falling again across Lancaster. Mel's parking lot glowed beneath soft yellow lights, while pickup trucks and older sedans sat dusted with ice. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee bacon grease and wet winter coats. Ethan was already there in a corner booth. He stood when he saw me approaching, which startled me slightly. Small gestures matter after years of emotional distance. You look cold, he said awkwardly. It's Pennsylvania in February. A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing again. We ordered coffee and turkey dinners, neither of us touched much afterward. For several minutes we just sat there listening to silverware clink against plates around us, while older couples talked quietly in nearby booths. Then Ethan exhaled heavily. I don't know how to do this conversation. I looked down at my coffee cup. Maybe just stop trying to do it perfectly. That seemed to land somewhere inside him. Because Ethan spent most of his life trying to avoid emotional mess entirely. Unfortunately, real relationships are messy. Especially honest ones. He rubbed his wedding ring nervously. I've been thinking about what Eleanor said. I waited quietly. And what you said. Still, I said nothing. Finally, Ethan looked directly at me. You carried us financially for years, didn't you? There it was. Not accusation, not defensiveness. Recognition. I nodded once. Sometimes? His jaw tightened painfully. Why didn't I know how bad things got? I thought about answering carefully, then decided against it. Because you stopped asking difficult questions, I said softly. The truth sat between us heavily. Not cruel, just undeniable. Ethan stared out the diner window toward the snow. When Dad died, he admitted quietly, my whole life became about keeping Mom stable. I listened carefully. She panicked constantly after that. Bills, mortgage, Melissa acting out. Everything felt fragile all the time. That matched exactly what Eleanor had described. Ethan's voice lowered. So I learned early that conflict made things worse. I nodded slowly. And eventually you treated all emotions like conflict. His eyes lifted toward mine. And for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't try avoiding the discomfort of being understood too accurately. I think I did, he whispered. The waitress refilled our coffee cups quietly before walking away again. Outside, snow continued falling across the parking lot in slow drifting sheets. Ethan swallowed hard. When Mom criticized you, I always told myself it wasn't serious enough to confront. That hurt because it was true. Women often suffer most, not from loud cruelty, but from the small humiliations nobody else considers bad enough to defend us against. She made me feel temporary, I admitted quietly. Ethan's face tightened immediately. That was never true. Wasn't it? He looked stunned by the question. And honestly, part of me was stunned I finally asked it aloud. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug carefully. Your mother spoke about the house, the family, even our future baby like I was just visiting. Ethan looked down immediately. Because he knew exactly what I meant. For years I'd existed emotionally adjacent to the Bennett family instead of fully inside it. Useful, dependable, helpful, but never entirely claimed. "I should have stopped it," he whispered. "Yes," I answered softly, "you should have." No anger, no raised voice. And somehow that calm honesty hit him harder than shouting ever could. His eyes filled slightly then. Real tears, embarrassed ones. People from our generation still struggle with emotional vulnerability sometimes, especially men raised to believe quietness equals strength. "I thought being calm made me a good husband," he admitted. I looked at him sadly. Sometimes calmness is just another form of disappearing. That sentence seemed to hollow something out inside him. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then Ethan laughed bitterly under his breath. "You know what scares me most." "What?" "That our daughter might grow up thinking this is what love looks like." The moment he said that, everything inside me softened slightly. Because finally he understood the real danger. Not the house, not the money, not Gloria. The emotional inheritance. The patterns children absorb silently while adults pretend nothing harmful is happening. Ethan wiped at his eyes quickly. "I don't want her growing up learning women should carry everything quietly." I felt tears sting behind my own eyes then. Because that sentence acknowledged my entire invisible life in one moment. Back at the Bennett house later that night, Gloria accidentally overheard more of our conversation than either of us realized. After leaving the diner, Ethan had called home while driving through the snow. What he didn't know was that his phone partially connected to the kitchen Bluetooth speaker before disconnecting again. Long enough for Gloria to hear several painful sentences echo through the empty kitchen. Including this one. "I failed her for years because keeping peace felt easier than protecting my wife." That sentence shattered something inside Gloria Bennett. Not publicly, not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of emotional break older women often hide behind practical tasks and busy hands. Later that night, unable to sleep, Gloria wandered upstairs toward the nursery. The yellow walls glowed softly beneath the nightlight Claire had bought months earlier. Tiny baby clothes hung neatly inside the closet. A stuffed rabbit sat beside the crib. Half-finished storybooks waited on the shelf. For the first time since the baby shower, Gloria allowed herself to truly look at the room Claire created for her granddaughter. Not as territory, not as family legacy. As love. And standing there alone in the nursery while snow fell quietly outside, Gloria finally broke down crying. Not because she lost control. Because somewhere deep down, she realized how much damage she caused trying so desperately not to lose the people she loved. Gloria Whitmore showed up at Eleanor's farmhouse on a Tuesday morning, carrying a blueberry pie and looking terrified. Not angry, not defensive. Terrified. I remember standing at the kitchen sink rinsing strawberries when Eleanor glanced through the window and quietly said, "Well, that took less time than I expected." My stomach tightened instantly. "Do I have to let her in?" Eleanor dried her hands calmly on a dish towel. "No," she answered honestly, "but I think you should." That's the complicated thing about healing later in life. Sometimes closure arrives wearing the face of the person who hurt you. Outside, late February rain drizzled softly across the farmhouse porch, while Gloria stood clutching the pie dish like it was emotional armor. She looked older than usual somehow. Smaller. For years I'd only seen her through the lens of tension and criticism, but standing there alone in the cold without Melissa beside her or Ethan buffering the conversation, she suddenly looked exactly what she truly was. A widowed woman in her 70s afraid of becoming emotionally unnecessary. I opened the door slowly. Gloria gave a stiff little nod. "I brought pie." I almost smiled despite myself. Not because it was charming. Because older Americans often use food when they don't know how to use vulnerability. "Come in," I said quietly. She stepped inside, carefully removing her damp coat, while Eleanor tactfully disappeared upstairs to check laundry that absolutely did not need checking. Gloria stood awkwardly in the kitchen for several seconds. Then finally, "You look tired." "I'm 8 months pregnant." "That's fair." The tiny moment of mutual honesty almost felt surreal. I poured coffee mostly to give both of us something to do with our hands. Outside, the window's rain blurred the frozen Pennsylvania fields gray. Inside, silence stretched carefully between us. Then Gloria surprised me completely. I heard Ethan crying. I looked up slowly. The night he came home from the diner. Her voice weakened slightly. I don't think I've heard my son cry since Frank died. That landed heavily. Because suddenly I understood something painful. Ethan's emotional silence hadn't started with me. It started decades earlier. Gloria wrapped both hands around her coffee mug tightly. When Frank passed, she said quietly, I became afraid all the time. Not dramatic fear. Practical fear. Mortgage fear. Medical bill fear. Loneliness fear. The kind that settles into your nervous system permanently after loss. I needed Ethan, she admitted softly. Too much, probably. I stayed quiet. Because we both knew that wasn't the whole story. Gloria sighed heavily. You made everything look easy. That startled me enough I actually laughed once under my breath. Nothing felt easy. No, Gloria whispered, but you never complained. There it was. The dangerous misunderstanding women of my generation often create accidentally. People assume calm endurance means something costs us less. In reality, it usually means we learned not to burden others with our pain. Gloria stared down into her coffee. You were good at things I wasn't. I blinked slowly. Claire, she swallowed hard, you made people feel safe. The honesty of that nearly undid me. Not because it erased the hurt. Because it explained it. For years I thought Gloria hated me. But sitting there in Eleanor's quiet kitchen, I finally realized something more complicated. She resented how naturally I filled emotional roles she never learned how to hold herself. Nurturing, patience, warmth, stability. Especially after years of surviving through control instead. I thought Ethan loved you more than he needed me, she admitted quietly. The room went very still after that. Because suddenly we weren't talking about casseroles or houses or baby showers anymore. We were talking about grief. About widowhood, about aging, about the terror of becoming emotionally replaceable. I folded my hands carefully around my coffee cup. You hurt me anyway, I said softly. Gloria's eyes filled immediately. I know. No excuses, no defensiveness. Just truth. And somehow that mattered more than perfect apologies. Rain tapped softly against the windows while neither of us spoke for a while. Then Gloria whispered something I never expected to hear from her. I was cruel during your pregnancy. I looked down. Yes. I made you feel unwelcome in your own home. Another pause. Yes. Her chin trembled slightly. I think... She stopped, visibly struggling. I think I kept trying to remind myself the family still belonged to me. That sentence explained everything. The comments, the control, the territorial behavior. Not because I threatened Gloria intentionally. Because aging sometimes makes people cling harder to emotional ownership when they fear becoming irrelevant. Especially older mothers. I rested one hand gently against my stomach where the baby shifted lazily beneath my sweater. She's your granddaughter too, I said quietly. Gloria looked up sharply then. And for the first time since I'd known her, I watched pure shame cross her face. I know, she whispered. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly where Eleanor was very obviously giving us privacy while pretending not to listen. Gloria wiped beneath her eyes awkwardly. Melissa thinks I'm weak for coming here. That didn't surprise me. Melissa treated vulnerability like failure because she grew up inside the same emotional system Ethan did. Just adapted differently. She's angry, Gloria continued. She's always angry. A sad little smile crossed Gloria's face. Yes, she admitted softly. That part's my fault too. By the time she left the farmhouse 2 hours later, nothing was magically fixed. Real life doesn't work that way. But something important had shifted. For the first time, Gloria and I had spoken honestly without Ethan standing between us trying to keep everyone emotionally comfortable. And honesty, even painful honesty, creates space where healing can finally breathe. Over the next several weeks, Ethan began changing too. Not through grand speeches. Through behavior. He started attending parenting classes at the community center every Thursday night. He reorganized business accounts himself instead of quietly relying on me to handle everything. When Melissa criticized me over the phone one evening, Ethan interrupted her calmly and said, "You don't get to talk about Claire like that anymore." That single sentence probably took him more courage than most people realized. Slowly, carefully, the emotional atmosphere around our marriage began changing. And one rainy evening in early March, I carried my overnight bag back into the Bennett house. Not because guilt forced me to. Not because pressure demanded it. Because for the first time in years it finally felt possible that I might belong there too. My daughter was born on a rainy April morning just after 6:30. After 19 hours of labor, 3 cups of terrible hospital coffee for Ethan, and one near argument with an exhausted nurse over ice chips, little Emma Grace Bennett arrived screaming into the world with a full head of dark hair and lungs powerful enough to shake the maternity ward. And the moment they placed her against my chest, everything inside me went quiet. Not magically healed. Just quiet. People romanticize childbirth sometimes, especially in movies. But at 36, after a difficult pregnancy and months of emotional stress, what I mostly felt was overwhelming relief. Relief that she was healthy. Relief that she was breathing. Relief that maybe our family still had time to become something gentler than what we almost turned into. Outside the hospital window, rain slid softly down the glass while Ethan sat beside my bed crying openly without embarrassment for the first time since I'd known him. "She's beautiful," he whispered. I looked down at Emma's tiny wrinkled face. "She looks angry." That made him laugh through tears. And somehow hearing my husband laugh honestly again felt almost as healing as holding my daughter. The months after Emma's birth weren't perfect. No real family transformation ever is. There were sleepless nights, financial stress, tension, moments old habits tried creeping back into the room. But something fundamental had changed inside our house. People finally started telling the truth. And truth, even uncomfortable truth, leaves less room for emotional loneliness to quietly grow. Gloria changed most slowly. At 71, emotional patterns become deeply wired into people. You don't simply wake up transformed because of one painful conversation. But little things shifted. She stopped criticizing how I held Emma, stopped correcting every parenting decision, stopped treating kindness like weakness. One afternoon I came downstairs after putting the baby to sleep and found Gloria folding tiny baby clothes at the kitchen table. Carefully, tenderly. When she noticed me watching, she looked awkward for a second before quietly saying, "You were right about the fragrance-free detergent. Her skin looks less irritated." That was it. No dramatic apology. But older women often express love through adjustment rather than speeches. And somehow that small acknowledgement meant more to me than performative guilt ever could. Melissa remained distant. She visited occasionally, usually bringing expensive baby clothes and tension into the room simultaneously. Some people struggle when family systems become healthier because chaos was the only emotional language they ever learned. Still, even Melissa softened slightly around Emma. Babies have a strange way of exposing the difference between performance and genuine connection. Ethan worked hardest of all. Not because he was trying to win me back. Because he finally understood marriage wasn't something maintained automatically by a woman silently absorbing every burden. For the first time since we married, he became emotionally present consistently. Not perfectly, consistently. There's a difference. He learned nighttime feedings, handled bills without waiting for reminders, started communicating before stress became emotional distance. One Saturday morning I walked downstairs expecting to find him watching sports. Instead, I found him standing in the kitchen wearing one of Emma's burp cloths over his shoulder while trying to follow a pancake recipe from his phone. Flour covered half the counter. The pancakes looked terrible, but watching him try made me emotional anyway. "You know those are burned, right?" I asked gently. He looked over sheepishly. "I'm learning." And honestly, that sentence described our entire marriage now. Not fixed, learning. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitmore quietly became part of our family in ways none of us expected. Emma adored her instantly. Every Thursday afternoon, Eleanor visited carrying homemade soup, old children's books, or strange antique toys she found in town. Watching her rock Emma near the living room window while rain tapped softly outside became one of my favorite sights in the world. One evening while helping me wash bottles, Eleanor smiled softly and said, "You know, families don't usually break all at once." I nodded. "They crack slowly." "Yes," she replied, "but healing happens slowly too." That stayed with me. Because for years I thought love meant endurance. Patience, sacrifice, keeping peace. But now I understood something different. Love also requires visibility. You cannot build healthy families around one person disappearing emotionally to keep everyone else comfortable. Especially women. Especially mothers. Especially caregivers. By late summer, the backyard garden had fully bloomed again behind the house. One Sunday evening, Ethan grilled hamburgers outside while Gloria rocked Emma gently on the patio swing. Church friends chatted around folding tables while cicadas buzzed softly through the warm Pennsylvania air. Ordinary life, but peaceful in a way our family had never truly managed before. At one point, Ethan stood up holding a paper plate and cleared his throat awkwardly. Everybody looked toward him. He glanced at me nervously before speaking. "I spent years thinking I was protecting this family," he said quietly. "But really, Claire was carrying most of us while I stayed silent." The yard went completely still. Even Gloria lowered her eyes. Ethan continued. "She saved our home, our finances, and honestly probably our marriage too, and I don't think I appreciated any of it enough." Emotion rose so quickly in my throat I couldn't speak. Because after years of emotional invisibility, being fully acknowledged in front of the people who once overlooked you feels almost disorienting. Ethan looked directly at me. "You deserved a partner," he said softly, "not another person to take care of." Tears filled my eyes instantly. Not because the past disappeared, because finally someone named it correctly. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the back porch holding Emma against my chest while sunset faded across the trees. Inside the house I could hear Ethan laughing softly with Gloria while they cleaned dishes together. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds, and for the first time in years home no longer felt like a place where I needed to earn my belonging. It simply felt like home. If this story touched you, I hope it reminds you to appreciate the quiet people holding your family together before exhaustion forces their sacrifices into the open. And if you've ever spent years shrinking yourself emotionally just to keep peace inside a relationship, I hope you remember this. Love should never require invisibility. Thank you for listening to my story, and if it stayed with you tonight, don't forget to share, reflect, and subscribe for more stories about healing family and second chances later in life.